It's the Legend of Zelda, and it's really rad.
A dark villain, a plucky underdog, and a whole load of exploration, from a boy exploring the countryside near his home to one of the greatest franchises ever. Since it began in 1986, this iconic franchise has captivated players around the globe with its timeless tales of heroism, exploration, and adventure. From the humble beginnings of an 8-bit icon to the sprawling open-world epics of modern sequels, The Legend of Zelda has remained a steadfast beacon in the ever-evolving landscape of gaming. Despite the franchise running for over 30 years, each game feels reassuringly familiar. Players step into the boots of Link, a courageous hero who must overcome overwhelming odds, wield the Fable Master Sword, usually against the evil Ganon, who wishes to enslave all of the fantastical lands of Hyrule. But Link doesn't stand alone. He has Princess Zelda by his side, a character whose role has become more and more involved, especially in the more recent games in the series. Hello viewers, it's good to see you. I'm Will from Cultured Vultures, and basically this is The Legend of Zelda. And if you love hearing about your favourite franchises, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll have more of this very soon. Now, do bear in mind that this series is very expansive, so we will not be discussing any spin-offs or mobile titles in much detail, if any at all, and certainly no Wand of Gamelon. If you want to see another series get the basically treatment, then let us know in the comments down below. The Legend of Zelda was inspired by Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto's adventures as a young boy. Young Miyamoto would spend his days exploring the forests and caves of his home in Sonobe, Kyoto, and wanted to create this experience in a game. Zelda director and writer Takashi Tezuka would put in some of his own inspiration, specifically from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. They would also add some European inspiration. For instance, the Master Sword is obviously a reference to Excalibur, and Link's horse Epona is named after the Celtic goddess of fertility. Our journey begins in 1986 with the release of the very first installment of the series, The Legend of Zelda. Released on February 21st, The Legend of Zelda was a groundbreaking achievement in video game design. Sure, while there were other top-down action-adventure titles, none came close to the mastery of The Legend of Zelda. It was hailed as a masterpiece, and praise was given to its, for the time, open-world design and non-linear gameplay, and it was also a smash hit, becoming one of the fastest-selling NES games of all time. Fans praised The Legend of Zelda, captivating by its vast world and sense of freedom, but it wasn't without its faults. Some players disliked the lack of guidance, and sometimes the puzzles felt a little unclear. Without a detailed map or clear direction, exploration could be both thrilling and frustrating. Despite this, The Legend of Zelda stood apart from his peers, offering players levels of freedom not seen before, and was key in defining the early adventure game genre. The Legend of Zelda set a new standard for video games, laying the foundation for a legendary franchise that would endure for decades to come. And this was only the beginning of Link's legendary journey. In 1987, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link took the series in a new direction, introducing side-scrolling platforming and RPG elements to the franchise. Nintendo had huge success with the Super Mario Bros. And, well, side-scrollers, they were kind of popular. Another possible reason for the change in design was to quickly get a sequel out the door after the high sales of The Legend of Zelda. Reviews were generally positive, with some praising the side-scrolling and RPG elements, but some criticised the departure of the top-down formula established in the original game. While Zelda 2 sold very well, it had to be said that the game has received some retroactive criticism for the change to the formula, and is seen as a bit of a black sheep of the franchise. Despite the disappointment of Zelda 2, the series had serious franchise potential, and much like Super Mario Bros., would receive its own cartoon series as part of the Super Mario Bros. Super Show. It ran for a single season. The Game Boy would also get in on the Zelda craze with its handheld spin-off, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Link's Awakening takes Link out of Hyrule and instead places him on Koholint Island, where he is tasked with waking the Windfish. Link's Awakening features some frankly odd cameos, including Yoshi, Kirby, and Mr. Right. He's the guy from SimCity, if you've forgotten. It remains a very popular game in the series and would later be ported to the Game Boy Color and would much later receive a full-on remake for the Switch. Nintendo would rightly give the series some breathing room, and we wouldn't get a new Zelda game until The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past in 1991. And this game would raise the bar for 16-bit action RPGs. A Link to the Past would build upon what came before, returning to the top-down, quote-unquote open-world style environment. This third entry in the Zelda series offered a bigger and more varied world with improved graphics and sound. But the world of gaming was changing. Soon 2D pixels would be a thing of the past, and we would move forward to the world of polygons. Many franchises franchises struggled to make that jump to 3D, but would The Legend of Zelda fail like so many others in this new generation?
It's a total fabrication. It never happened.
The Legend of Zelda would go quiet for quite a while, with no major releases until Nintendo's Ultra 64 had been out in stores for a couple of years. This release would be a little known hidden gem called The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, the first 3D game in the series. 3D was the future in the 90s, and many franchises such as Castlevania and Sonic were struggling to adapt their series to this new style of gaming. Ocarina of Time, however, suffered no such problems. Nintendo managed to create a 3D adaptation of The Legend of Zelda that not only managed to recreate the feel of the original games, but built upon it. A 3D world, complex mechanics and time travel mechanics all made Ocarina of Time feel like a step up in the series as well as a faithful sequel. Nintendo had managed to redefine the quote-unquote open world genre once again. Ocarina of Time is loved by fans far and wide, and for many, this is a highlight of the series. It's not perfect, just ask fans about the water temple and watch them begin to rock back and forth. Nevertheless, thanks to fantastic design, beautiful graphics and the feel of adventure and exploration carried over from the early 2D titles in the series, Ocarina of Time has to be one of the best games in the series as a whole. Ocarina of Time received near perfect reviews across the board and is currently the highest rated game on Metacritic, holding an average of 99 out of 100 based on critical reviews. Not content with making the greatest game ever made, the Big N would follow up Ocarina of Time 2 years later with Majora's Mask, also on the Nintendo 64. Majora's Mask was more than just another game in the same world, it offered a different take on the universe that Link inhabits. The sequel was noticeably darker in tone and reflected more abstract and at times disturbing aspects of the series. The setting was moved from the often lush and verdant lands of Hyrule to the dark and almost gothic worlds of Termina. Not only that, but the moon of Termina is on a collision course with the planet itself and there's only 3 days to stop it. This really felt like a more mature experience. Just like us, Zelda had grown up. This of course is impossible, but it all ties into the unique gameplay of Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask features a Groundhog Day-esque repeating 3-day cycle where you must progress a little further each time. Majora's Mask had a lot to live up to, it being the sequel to the greatest game ever made and all, but it is a worthy sequel and holds its own immensely well. It easily is one of the best games for the Nintendo 64. Between this and the next profile game in the series, there would be 2 games for the Game Boy Color. Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages were Pokemon-style dual releases in which owning both versions of the game would unlock extra content and a true ending. This is one of only a few Zelda games not directly developed by Nintendo themselves. It was actually developed by Flagship, a supremely underrated studio funded by both Nintendo and Capcom. Seasons and Ages are a unique and fascinating pair of games in the Zelda series that rarely seem to get talked about. Well, apart from us when we place them on the best Game Boy Color games video, why not give that a watch as well? There was also a Game Boy Advance port of A Link to the Past, which added 4 Swords mode, a 4-player co-op adventure. While we'd love to go into more detail on 4 Swords and other spin-offs, there simply is no time here. This video is all about the big cheese, the meat and potatoes of the Zelda series. We may come back to these smaller titles in future. The next console entry into the series would be 2002's The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker on the GameCube, which was a far cry from the game that many had hoped we would get. The game took the idea of Hyrule and filled it with a flood, turning the world into a series of islands that had to be navigated by sailing your boat. Naturally, with Nintendo's new console doing the legwork, Wind Waker was an overall smoother experience with better combat, gameplay and UI. One thing that was a huge improvement but was also a point of significant controversy was the graphics. Wind Waker feels like it is harkening back to the earlier Zelda games with a cel-shaded cartoon style and an abstract Link, with an elongated head to rival that of Hey Arnold. Some fans did not like this style and much to my shame, neither did I at the time. After the dark and somewhat gritty Majora's Mask, Wind Waker appeared to be childish and was far removed from the earnest yet noble hero of Hyrule that players imagined him to be. Fans were perhaps worried that Wind Waker was not intended for old school fans, and that they were perhaps being pushed aside for a younger audience. This of course was not true, as Wind Waker was a deeper experience than ever before. Its graphics in particular have become a much loved aspect of the series, and even today Wind Waker is one of the best looking games in the entire series. Perhaps even better looking than some of the games that came after this. It actually made our list of most timeless games just a few months ago. The style was later reused in a number of 3DS games. Early versions of Wind Waker would also come bundled with Ocarina of Time Master Quest, a modified version of the game that was originally planned for the 64DD add-on. The GameCube would also see The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures. Similar to the Game Boy Advance's Four Swords, it was a co-op game which actually allowed you to use the Game Boy Advance as a controller for the GameCube. The Advance would also get its own Zelda game in the form of the Minish Cap. Wind Waker had been a huge success, but it was the first time that Nintendo had seen fans question their artistic decisions. Commercially available internet was bigger than ever, and it was more common in people's homes, which led to more and more people sharing their opinions online. So what sort of steps would Nintendo have to take to avoid this sort of grassroots backlash? Another main Zelda title wouldn't be released until 2006 with the debut of Twilight Princess. It really felt that Nintendo took the criticism of Wind Waker to heart as they returned to a relatively normal looking game here. In fact, Twilight Princess feels more like a traditional follow-up to those Nintendo 64 releases. Landing on the GameCube and Nintendo Wii, Twilight Princess had a control method not too dissimilar from Ocarina of Time, as well as the return of Link's faithful steed Epona and an updated yet recognizable character model. Link gains the ability to transform into a wolf, and in doing so gains several advantages such as faster movement, ability to follow scent trails, as well as a chance to dig for hidden items and passages. There were some minor differences between the GameCube and Wii titles, most notably their controls. The Wii had not yet become one of the biggest games consoles of all time, and it would soon become so thanks to it being one of the first major consoles to integrate motion controls. Twilight Princess's motion controls were fairly basic, but due to it being at the forefront of this latest gaming trend, it helped this most recent entry in the series become its biggest selling title at that point. There would also be a couple of DS entries to the series, which largely took after the Wind Waker aesthetic. Phantom Hourglass would arrive in 2007 and would focus on the sailing aspects, also from Wind Waker. It would be followed up with 2009's Spirit Tracks, the bizarre train-based Zelda game, which despite the train driving aspect of the game was fairly similar to Phantom Hourglass. Motion controls would be a huge aspect in the Wii's success, but they were not perfect. There were a scrum of companies trying to get in on the motion control craze, including Microsoft Kinect and PlayStation Move. Nintendo had to stay ahead of the game. They did this by introducing Wii Motion Plus, an add-on for the Wiimote which made the motion controls more accurate. It was necessary for certain games to have this add-on, and one of those games was the latest Legend of Zelda entry, Skyward Sword, in 2011. Skyward Sword would keep the grown-up style of the newer Zelda games but would be brighter in tone overall. The mid-2000s muddy browns were now gone, and instead, Skyward Sword enjoyed a new palette similar in tone to those classic games. With Motion Plus, Skyward Sword allows for more accurate combat movement, a major improvement over Twilight Princess's wrist wiggles. Skyward Sword differed in design to the previous entry in the series. Skyward Sword took place in the floating islands of Skyloft and told a story from the far past in the Zelda lore, charting the creation of the Master Sword. Due to its setting being entirely on floating islands which have to be traversed to progress, it does feel a little more of a linear experience, although it does follow a familiar get through the dungeons to continue style of gameplay. Sure, it's a fairly linear experience, but it was well designed, making progression in the game feel natural and satisfying. Despite being a solid game, the unusual design made it for a somewhat of a polarizing experience for Zelda fans. Skyward Sword also received rave reviews from critics. Also in 2011, the 3DS would receive a port of Ocarina of Time, which would include the Master Quest content, and Four Swords Anniversary Edition would land on the DSiWare store. Now that takes me back. An enhanced port of Wind Waker would arrive on the Wii U in 2013, and over the next couple of years the 3DS would receive a couple of original titles. 2013 also saw The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, and later in 2015 the last multiplayer adventure to date, Triforce Heroes. With the Zelda formula nailed down and the series constantly receiving top marks, where could it possibly go from here? Nintendo certainly aren't slouches, but we have to admit Zelda hasn't massively changed since the first entry in the series. The basic premise is still the same: traverse a world, solve dungeons which open up more of the world, and in turn more dungeons, repeat as necessary, and defeat the big bad. Nintendo had done this for years and received rave reviews for doing so. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But the industry was changing, and Nintendo knew this. For the upcoming Breath of the Wild, Nintendo wanted to rethink the conventions of the series What is Zelda really about? Well, we have talked about Zelda being one of the first open world games. It was never really a true, fully open world. Each game had an overworld which linked the dungeons, and sure, these worlds were full of enemies, villages and NPCs. So far, so open world. But generally, the world would open up incrementally, and while exploration was a key component of the series, you could not fully explore the world freely. But what is open world? Nintendo would have easily looked at other open world games on the market, most notably Skyrim. But it wouldn't be Skyrim that was the ultimate inspiration for Nintendo. They also looked at Shadow of the Colossus, a game on reflection that is much closer in terms of design to Breath of the Wild than Skyrim. Shadow of the Colossus also contained an open world, climbing as traversal and horse riding as a major component. Nintendo also took visual inspiration from the works of Hayao Miyazaki and his beautiful portfolio at Studio Ghibli. Breath of the Wild would finally land on Switch and Wii U. Wii U! You know, I'd actually forgotten that this had appeared on Wii U. You know, that feels so strange.
Yeah, we actually reviewed the game on Wii U, if you can believe it. Yeah, 7 out of 10. Terrible, awful game. Awful. Rubbish. Too much cooking.
Breath of the Wild would finally land on Switch and Wii U in 2017 and felt like both an evolution and a revolution. Hyrule was now fully open for your exploration and you can go pretty much anywhere. Link now had the ability to climb, and instead of mountains becoming obstacles that you had to find a path through or go around, Link can simply climb over. If you have the stamina, that is. Dungeons are also kinda gone. Instead, Link can up his powers by visiting shrines, which usually have some sort of puzzle or challenge to overcome. In return, you collect spirit orbs, which are exchanged for extra hearts or stamina. Shrines often took advantage of Nintendo's use of a modified Havok physics engine, and sometimes there were ways you could simply just cheese your way through. Instead of removing these from the game though, Nintendo embraced these workarounds. Also replacing dungeons with the divine beasts, areas of the map affected by 4 mechanical creatures designed to save Hyrule, but instead they have turned against it. Some of them require a bit of work to get to and to get on them, and they act as dungeons in themselves, often requiring puzzle solving and combat to beat them. These beasts also have mini-bosses that you need to defeat, them all being offshoots of Calamity Ganon himself. Once all beasts have been solved and defeated, Calamity Ganon receives extra damage in the endgame, allowing you a slightly easier time. That endgame takes place in the ruins of Hyrule Castle, in which Zelda and Ganon have been sealed for 100 years as she attempts to subdue his power and prevent him from taking over Hyrule. Only Link can stop him now. Yeah, you guessed it, it was a smash hit. Critics lauded it as one of the greatest games ever made, and most likely, and at least retroactively speaking, probably the best of the series. Breath of the Wild sold immensely well and is by far the highest selling game in the series with over 30 million copies sold. That's 3 times more than the previous best-selling game, Twilight Princess. Some fans were critical of the emptiness of Breath of the Wild's open world, and while this may be technically true, as it doesn't have any huge areas positively bustling with people, that misses the point of the world itself. Breath of the Wild's open world is a sandbox, a place to roam around and have fun in. There's Korok shrines and mysteries everywhere. Some people complained about weapon degradation, which I do understand. It's very different from other RPGs, especially as it doesn't allow you to repair them. But I choose to see this as a positive. Breath of the Wild always forced me to look out for new weapons, and I ended up trying weapons that I wouldn't normally use. I mean, who would choose to fight with a soup ladle? Sickos, that's who. Me. I am that sicko. Despite some minor faults, Breath of the Wild was a runaway success. It won Game of the Year from multiple sources and was a game changer for Nintendo. Nintendo had redefined the open world. While we waited for a fully fledged follow-up, we had a couple of titles to tide us over. First of all, Link's Awakening would receive a full-on remake for the Switch. It retained the top-down gameplay as well as plot and structure, and was a prime example of how to remake a game. Skyward Sword would also get the port treatment, with an enhanced version that featured a new control system, and a whole bunch of the same annoying discourse. We wouldn't get a full follow-up until 2023's The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, which finally answered the question, can Koroks visit space? A direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, it begins with Link and Zelda rebuilding Hyrule before the start of a new adventure. Sure, it's the same Hyrule we saw in the previous game, but with a few tweaks. Most importantly, some new toys. We now have the power to construct objects and vehicles using a Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts style building system, which adds lots of possibilities in traversing the world and, well, breaking the game as well. Nuts and bolts, eh? It's no grabbed by the ghoulies, but it's more influential than people give it credit for. 2 new areas would also be added. A Skyward Sword style floating islands area became accessible by traversing above the cloud, as well as a dark underworld that features pitch black darkness and other unspeakable creatures. While it doesn't mix up the formula too much, it gives us more of the same with a few new ways to enjoy it without getting repetitive, and that certainly isn't a bad thing. Again, it received rave reviews and sold amazingly well, eclipsing Twilight Princess. These new style of Zelda games are now considered the pinnacle of the Zelda experience, offering a huge sandbox for you to play, explore, fight and get lost in. These games are now probably as close to the experience of being a young Shigeru Miyamoto as he explores the woodlands of his childhood home. Could you imagine how different the industry would have been if he'd grown up in somewhere like Kettering, for instance? And that's basically The Legend of Zelda. Thank you for sticking with us for this first episode of Basically. This was a big one to start with, but it sure is a good one. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what was your first Zelda experience? Mine was A Link to the Past. I borrowed it off a friend but never completed it. I guess I know what I'm doing next weekend.